that was inappropriate, that payment. They've also apologised profusely to Gary Johnson, who came forward to say that he was abused at the hands of Eddie Heath, who has since died. And they're also bringing in an independent law firm to look into what happened and how it was dealt with, and whether or not the club could have handled things differently.
I think I mean, just desperately sad, desperately sad when you see these men who had their childhoods and probably big chunks of their adulthoods wrecked by the abuse they underwent. The fact that there was this silence extending throughout a whole tranche of society is desperately troubling, and I'm afraid the fact that it happened at the BBC, and it happened in schools, and it happened in care homes, and it happened in the church does certainly seem to indicate that this has happened in almost, it's been a kind of routine part of everyday life across society, wherever there have been children and adults entrusted to the care of those children, which is very, 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 very alarming.
And just to say, sorry Matthew, just to say that we have now got the Sunday People has just come in, and there's Jamie Forrester is on the front of the Sunday People saying that he was targeted by a paedophile gang, suggesting that perhaps a more organised element to it as well. So as you say, sort of incredibly disturbing.
It is disturbing, and
allegations.
I don't want to mitigate the scale and significance of this, but I would still like to say that the vast majority of football coaches are brilliant, wonderful people who mentor youngsters, enable them to grow as individuals, build character, all the great things that sport does. I think back to playing table tennis and two coaches in particular who completely changed my life. Inspirational people who did everything by the book. Just wonderful, wonderful people. And I did hear a few parents, friends of ours, talking about their children who are involved in sport, saying, you know what, I think, you know, should we withdraw them? Can we try? You know, safeguarding in child protection has got a lot better. And it'd be a shame if all coaches were tainted by the actions of what is without mitigating this. It needs to be a full investigation, get to the bottom of what happened. But I do still think that sport can be a tremendous force for good in young people's lives.
And you'd hope that the scale of this scandal and how shocked everyone is will make sure that the changes are in place to make sure that children are safe in future.
You certainly would, but they're talking 55 clubs. That is potentially a lot of people. I mean, that might be quite small as an overall proportion, but it's still a lot of people. And they've had, I think the NSPCC has had hundreds of calls just in a week. So it's heartbreaking, actually. And I think the people who have spoken out have been incredibly brave. I think to speak about sex abuse, I was going to say that sounds a bit sexist, but particularly for a guy, actually, but that's not true. It's very, very brave for both men and women who do that, and they live with, I think their lives are tarnished, often forever, and huge courage they've shown in doing this.
I agree.
Hello, good evening. Premier League leaders Chelsea have tonight offered a profuse apology to former player Gary Johnson after admitting for the first time that he was sexually abused as a youth team player in the 1970s. The Chelsea board says it's now called in an external law firm to review the way Mr Johnson's case was handled, claiming a confidentiality clause put in place was inappropriate, but insisting the club has no desire to hide any claims of historical abuse. Sky's Joe Tidy reports.
Night and day, people come to Stamford Bridge to soak up footballing history. But tonight, it's precisely Chelsea's past that's plunged the Premier League leaders into further crisis. Gary Johnson became the latest player to speak publicly about being sexually abused as a junior. Chelsea never apologised and paid to keep him quiet. Now it's become the first club to publicly say sorry. In a statement, they said, "It is clear that Gary Johnson suffered unacceptably while in our employment in the 1970s, for which the club apologises profusely. The decision to have a confidentiality clause in this case has been subject to significant scrutiny. In light of what we now know about the wide-scale abuse in football clubs in the 1970s and 1980s, it now believes that the use of such a clause, while understandable, was inappropriate in this instance." The news will come as a relief to Mr Johnson, who was abused hundreds of times in the 1970s. Chief Scout Eddie Heath, who is now deceased, is also linked to other claims of abuse. Lawyers of one other alleged victim says an apology from Chelsea will boost their case for compensation.
Chelsea's apology is very welcome. It shows that they're willing to be open to the fact that things did happen with Eddie Heath back in the time Gary Johnson was playing there. I think in terms of what it means for my client's case, it's difficult to say, as every case is different, and Chelsea may have a different view. But hopefully, this openness will be welcome, and they may be willing to accept liability in certain compensation claims.
Chelsea also announced that its independent inquiry will now not only be looking into whether or not child sex abuse took place, but specifically into how it handled Mr. Johnson's case. The club says it wants to learn lessons from what happened, but the Football Association is under increasing pressure to do something about any perceived cover-ups and start rebuilding trust in the game. At Chelsea's match at Manchester City today, fans had little confidence in the Football Association's ability to handle such an investigation itself. These views are underlined by a Sky poll, which asked people if they trusted the FA to investigate the claims properly. 20% said yes, but 57% said no. Perhaps even more troubling for the association, when we asked if the revelations would change how they felt about sending a child to play for a club, 48% said it would make no difference, but more than a third said they would be less likely to allow a child to play. And the Professional Footballers Association says the number of players contacting them with new abuse claims is growing all the time.
From the last week to 10 days, we've seen a dramatic flood of individuals coming forward. In the NSPCC helpline numbers, they said 860 has come forward. I'm not sure how many of them are members. I'm not sure how many of them are former and current. But if you get them sort of numbers coming forward already, it just shows you what the vast amounts will be coming forward later on.
At least 350 people have now come forward alleging they were victims of sexual abuse in football. 19 police forces and more than 50 clubs of all sizes are involved. But by issuing this apology, top of the league Chelsea are now at the centre of this scandal. Joe Tidy, Sky News at Stamford Bridge.
And another former footballer has come forward to claim that he was abused. Jamie Forrester tells the Sunday People he was targeted by a paedophile gang. We'll be taking a look at all the front pages at 11:30 tonight with Times columnist Matthew Syed and writer and columnist Christina Patterson.
£50,000 if you do not talk about it publicly. I think that is an absolute dereliction of duty, because it's only by talking publicly, finding out what happened, that you can encourage other people to come forward and find out precisely the scale of the historic problem that existed almost certainly at Chelsea and perhaps many other clubs. And for me, it's an indication of the denial that exists within some of the echelons of football to this day about this problem. And if it can be shown that the chief executive of Chelsea was on the committee at the time this disgraceful decision was made, then I think there has to be a question about whether they can survive.
Well, yes, and Chelsea have now publicly apologised to Gary Johnson, who made the allegations, and they've also referred to that confidentiality clause. They have said that it was inappropriate, haven't they? And they're now talking about getting in, or they have said that they've brought in an external law firm to look into whether anything was handled wrongly, whether they could have handled it better, so they're having a full investigation into that. But this scandal is just growing and growing, isn't it, Christina?
It is growing and growing, and it is, I mean, one wonders how many other areas of society this kind of thing has been happening in, because we've already had the care homes, we've had the church, we've had the BBC, and it seems that it takes one person to come forward at enormous, often personal cost, but huge courage, and then the floodgates are unleashed. I think the NSPCC has had a helpline for the last week or so, and it's had literally hundreds and hundreds of calls. We're talking 55 clubs here. That is an awful lot of people whose lives will have been severely damaged by their experiences. So it's very, very, very worrying.
And just briefly, let's just show people the front of the Sunday People, which has Jamie Forrester speaking out. They claim it as an exclusive there, talking about an abuse ring existing. So that would be obviously another element to this, if there were indeed some sense of an organised group of people.
It reeks of a cover-up, and particularly if it is a cover-up of illegal activity, then of course it's completely immoral and unjustified. I mean, the offences, the alleged offences committed against these boys were bad enough, but if people knew about it and did nothing about it and actually deliberately tried to cover it up in order to try to protect the reputation of their club or whatever, then that is a very serious
What would be very
situation
interesting
indeed.
is, did they fire the man involved at the same time, or did they just let him stay in place? Would be even more interesting.
Or like in the church, which we've seen before in the previous scandal, and there'll be others in other institutions as well to come, move them, shuffle them sideways somewhere, try to keep them quiet
Yes.
by putting them off into a dark corner.
Let's just move on to the